Oh, it's
Go
great to
for it,
be.
Jeremy.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here, and it's kind of fun to do this with Batya because we haven't talked in advance about this, but we have many other interactions going on many years, and so this is interesting to unpack in real time. Uh, I'm going to slightly disagree and say that the Jewish community is polarized, but I think we've always been polarized, and I don't think our polarization today is worse in the sense of deep fractions, deep fissures, significant chunks of Jews who fundamentally deny other parts of the Jewish community's legitimacy as to represent or speak for the Jewish community, who don't even care about or interact. I mean, you don't need to be a historian, although my practice comes from is as a historian, to go back and say the divides today between blue state Jews and red state Jews, or between whatever framework you want to put on, are not worse than the divides were between Mitnagdim and Hasidim and the secular Bundists in 19th century Eastern Europe. And I can remember in my own lifetime deep divides. I've been thinking a lot lately about New York City in the early 90s during the Crown Heights riots. There was a deep divide, a sense of abandonment by what I would call broadly Orthodox and Hasidic and conservative Jewish voters in the outer boroughs, to make a stereotype, against a liberal elite stereotyped as Manhattan. And those two communities weren't even talking to each other, to the sense that it was felt that the power structure of the Jewish community wasn't really aware of how embattled the Jewish community in Crown Heights felt in those days. I can remember growing up in Brooklyn and seeing different factions of the community literally in the streets taking up arms against each other. I mean, violent physical clashes in Borough Park and Crown Heights. And in things like the Soviet Jewry movement, we tell these grand stories of our unity of the American Jewish community in 1987, but that was after 20 years of like mostly students or young activists basically railing against the establishment for not standing up for a moral cause, and both of those factions being very frustrated with and challenged with the Israeli interaction in that. And like Gal Beckerman's got a great book about those factions. So like, we're polarized, but we've always been polarized. I think the difference is, one, that thanks to modern media in all of its forms, no faction can be dismissed or ignored. Every faction has a voice. Every faction has a space and can get attention, almost to equal levels, in a way that, say, 50 years ago, nobody was paying attention to the Mizrahi Jews in Israel. The media, the culture, the conversation was completely dominated by a single unifying centrist narrative, whether you bought into that or not in different times. But I do think the biggest difference there, and the hardest part, and I'm going to say this from the point of view of someone who's in the Jewish communal space, is that the polarization has become mapped onto American partisan behaviors. So it's not just about differing arguments about a vision for normative Judaism, or different arguments about our responsibility to the poor in our community or to Jews overseas or Israel. It actually gets mapped on, you're a Republican or a Democrat. And differences that were once internal to our conversations about different understandings about Jewish values and Jewish ideas now map onto partisan identifications, which are stronger in some ways than even our Jewish identity. And I'll even go farther and say, in a way that was not true 25 years ago, Jewish organizations are perceived as Democratic aligned or Republican aligned in a way that was not true a quarter century ago.
So just so everyone knows, before I ask the next question, Dalia did put the poll into the chat. So if you haven't checked that out, please jump in there and take that poll. We'll go through that information a little bit. So I'm curious, and I want to come back to Jeremy for this, sort of to dig in a little bit further. But Batya, I'm also interested in your opinion on the same basic question, although within the framework of your answer. Are there, do you think that the sort of, fusion, if you will, of cultural, ethnic, and partisan identity is driving a perception of greater levels of divergence in the community than is actually there? And then at the same time, Batya, which is the piggyback, is there like a perverse incentive structure that we're all playing in that sort of makes it seem as if the house might be on fire, but to Jeremy's point, it's not really any, it's not any warmer than it's been in the past.
I definitely think there's an element of our comfort, in a sense. I'm going to speak particularly in an American context, not talking about sort of Israelis and American Jews. Our comfort and sense of belonging as Americans has made us much more likely to map with other Americans who have similar value systems or similar broader issue-based agendas than we were even a quarter century ago. I also think there's an element of, frankly, our comfort with our own power as Jews individually and collectively in America that has changed the way we organize as a community. Even the idea, like, it was only in the mid 80s and early 90s that the first truly, like, the Republican Jewish Coalition and the National Jewish Democratic Council were formed. And you see them, those kinds of organizations that are organized around partisan identity have been largely kept out of Jewish communal table spaces that have always been about, we're not partisan, even if we value one way or another. And it comes from a comfort in our politics as Americans, that we no longer need to act as a unified Jewish community accessing like the State Department or the presidency in order to advocate with one priority set, that we can divide by partisan ideas. And that has pushed forward to more and more organizations that might once have been seen as sort of value mapping left of center or right of center, now being perceived, whether by themselves or by others in the spectrum of Jewish debate, as being a Democratic aligned organization or Republican aligned organization. And you can say, and we can get into very explicitly, but like, organizations that even 10 or 15 years ago, like ADL or J Street, might have been seen as liberal aligned, but not partisan, if not in their own language, are certainly mapped by others as those are mapped by other parties in the Jewish community as Democratic aligned organizations. And at the same time, other groups like the Orthodox Union or the ZOA that might have been seen 10 or 20 years ago as center-right or center-right on some things or more conservative on some things are now just seen as Republican, for better or worse.
I completely agree with you, Jeremy. I think that it's really important to remember we're the luckiest Jews to ever have lived in the history of the universe. And that a lot of these questions have a lot to do with our unique privilege in this moment. I'll say a few things. The first is, obviously Trump is a very difficult human to ignore and has a certain effect and impact on the people around him. And in that sense, I think, certainly the ADL was sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, on the one hand, wanting to maintain its, its sort of position as a civil rights organization, on the other hand, faced with the challenges of Trump's America. At the same time, I do think that something that happens on the left that does not really happen on the right is you have people saying things like, well, my Jewish values makes me a liberal or makes me a Democrat, that, it's because, like it's because of the Torah says this, and that, and that's why I have to be a liberal and a Democrat. And I'll be honest, I think that's bad and dangerous, because one of the things Trump did was he made everything feel political. And to accept those terms of his, that everything in your life is about him, which is what he wanted. He wanted you to think about him all the time. To sort of take your religious identity and make it a not just a political one, but a partisan one. I think that that's really unhealthy as Jews, unhealthy as Americans, and it's to accept the terms that, as I said earlier, the people who are getting power out of polarization have laid out, as opposed to rejecting them and saying, I am a Jew, I am an American, and I decide what that means on every issue. There's not some random organization that can tell me what that means, or some random party. So I think that is sort of, and what was funny is it would come up like I remember I was talking once on a Facebook Live about how a lot of Jews of color are actually Republicans because they come from repressive places like Iran or Cuba or Uzbekistan or the former Soviet Union, right? So and somebody put in the chat and they said, I don't understand how people who came from those places could vote for a literal fascist. And I was like, I mean, you're literally from the most privileged country, the most privileged place on the planet. You are lecturing people who escaped Iran about what a literal fascist looks like. It was so exactly that, like just the inability to think outside of that place. So I don't think I'm answering your question, but I did say a few things, so I'll cede the floor.
They were wise, even if it wasn't a direct answer. So let's actually use that as a good pivot point, though, right? We just sort of exited we technically have not yet exited what has been a very interesting, unique, in many ways divisive, hyper-political presidency, and we're about to, in 30 some odd days, walk into a new reality. I'm curious, and I have some guess based on some of the things you just said, Batya, we'll start with you, how you think this changes for the dialogue inside the Jewish community specifically changes now that we are almost to a Biden administration, a Biden-Harris administration.
Okay, so I'll say two things. The first is, if Trump wasn't able to get us to fight amongst ourselves about Israel, I don't think anybody can. And he didn't. He tried to turn Israel into a culture war issue, and we resisted. I mean, the Jews resisted that. And I think because we resisted that and insisted on remaining a bridge, because of that, we were able to keep that from happening. And so I don't imagine, people like, the big debate now is on the liberal Zionist left is, are you a person who thinks we should condition aid to Israel, or are you not? It's like that is not a real divide. Like that's a tiny little, that's not a real divide. Those are certainly not polar opposites, like American Jews are liberal Zionists, like by and large, 2/3 of us totally agree on everything. And if you're like here or you're here, sorry, that's not a polarization. And so to me, it's like if Trump didn't manage to do that, like, everything's sort of, I don't sort of buy that, like there was, this big disruption and things are going to change. But I will say, okay, so I'm in the media, I'm a journalist, and the media has got a huge Trump bump, right? You see that's everywhere, CNN, CBS, the New York Times, like a lot of them, New York Times was facing serious financial distress before Trump, and now is doing very, very well. And the lesson they took from that was, the sociologist actually counted the amount of times that his name occurs in the New York Times, and it's once every 250 words or so. And that's not an accident, because that's their business model, right? So what are they going to do now, right? Well, you're already seeing what they're going to do now. Like they're obsessed with this lawyer of his, Sidney Powell, like this crazy person who he elevated, and then she sort of fell away, like all of his nincompoops. But now the New York Times is talking about this person every day who does not matter, right? Like it's all over, but they're still talking about him every day. I bring this all up to say that the whole, anyone who voted for Trump is a Nazi. The reason we see that so much in the media and on Twitter is because people are making money off of it. But it's very sad that has seeped out into Jewish culture. Like, as far as I'm concerned, the most amazing thing about being a Jew in Trump's America was that I got to go to Shabbos meals where we would actually argue about Trump. And there are very few places left in America where that was still happening, where people were still actually in that fight together. Like the Shabbos was more important than whether you had voted for Trump or not. Like there was a thing that bound us together that was more important. So to me, like the burden of a democracy lies with the losers, right? They are the ones who have to kind of sort of not, they have to accept, right, the peaceful transfer of power, but the winners need to not gloat, right? They need to not sort of make it hard for them not to wage war against us as the winners, right? And so a lot of that burden is going to be on liberal Jews. How do you treat the Trump voter in your community, or who is not in your community but should be in your community? I mean, to me, that is the key right now. Like, okay, we won, right? Like, how do you treat the Jews who disagree with you right now? That is the most important question. And there's only one answer to that, and it is, you have to treat them with love. There's like, that's obviously the only answer. And it's very hard because they voted for somebody absolutely terrible, right? Like, this is not an easy thing to do, but that, I think, to me, that is the mission of our community right now.
Same question for you, Jeremy.
I'm going to work my way backwards from saying that I totally agree with what Batya just said about the imperative now for, let's not even say liberal Jews, Jews who are in the majority of the community that clearly voted to reject Trump, that the obligation is to not gloat, and that the really important hard work ahead is about making sure that the other, I don't know, about 30% of our community, and some polling data suggests that it's actually a slightly higher number of those under 40, i.e. the generation of most of the people in this group that voted for President Trump. They have to be, if we have a vision of Jewish community that is the whole of the Jewish people, then we have to find us a way to talk to and engage with and not push out further that 30% of American Jews. I do think it's going to be really hard, not just because of all the judgment of how could you vote for that horrible man. And I think that requires interrogation of what were your fears about Democrats? What were your fears about Biden? What are you, and what are the things that you like that maybe are Israel or go beyond Israel? Because I think it's more to it than that, that leads you to vote for someone despite his clear moral flaws as an individual. And I think that's going to be a hard conversation to have, both because it's hard for a lot of us are in our own bubbles and are not even ready to hear that conversation. And we're also not even interacting. You know, we sit in different spaces. We don't, a lot of people in my day-to-day life are not even interacting with that part of the Jewish community, and vice versa. And I have this, I have this constant mantra of, on a regular basis, or at least before we were all stuck at home, of virtually weekly, people in my own community, and I'm saying my own community, the entirety of the Boston Jewish community, coming up to me and saying, everybody I speak to agrees with me that, and in regard to whatever's in the news, and then somebody else later that day, and possibly, within minutes, saying the exact opposite. Everybody agrees with me, because, people in our community are convinced that everybody, there's just nobody else around them is on the other side of this equation, and they're not even talking within one synagogue across these barriers. So I do want to say, in a slightly more analytical level, so much of the discourse this last 4 years, and Batya really unpacked this at a media level, but at a sort of societal level and at an identity level, so much of the conversation is so put on Trump as a person, and even the Republican Party, even just that moment this year where we don't need a platform, our platform is whatever Donald Trump tweets. The party is going to have to go through some identity, and they're clearly not ready for it. And by the way, Oren, I'm going to say, we have to say every single time the election is over, but the Republican Party is not ready to do the post-election reflection of what it means to be a party without Trump. I think for a lot of us in Jewish communal space, there's going to be an interesting and important and complicated navigation around what it means to engage or re-engage with various leaders and actors within Republican Party who, weren't all in, didn't actually take on West Wing jobs, but sort of looked the other way or downplayed it, or managed to say that they didn't see his tweets on a regular basis, that they were running through the halls on Capitol Hill. And how do we engage with those people, and how are they going to form new voices? In a similar way, I think there's going to be something different. And this goes to the partisan behavior within the Jewish community. Those who frankly wanted more of the Jewish community to see the Republican Party as the only viable home for Jewish values and Jewish interests clearly tried to cherry pick voices and leaders in the Democratic Party to define the last 4 years. And that's much easier to do with a party in opposition, a party that frankly was fractured and fighting within itself in public. And it's easy to lift up, whether it's the squad or someone who isn't even in an electoral position, but has ability of movement building, to lift those people up and say, they speak for the party. They are what Democrats are. And I think a lot of the next 4 years is going to be what is an actual presidential-led party? How is an actual Biden administration leading and defining the center of a party on issues of concern to our community? And how does that shift the fights within our community about that party? And I don't pretend to say that it's going to suddenly be like, hallelujah and roses and, unicorns. I mean, the Obama years were not great in terms of some of the fractures within the Jewish community, but it will be different. And we're going to have to navigate that. And to the extent that, President-elect Biden has stood up and said, I won. Those people didn't win the primaries. I won. This is my party. This is my agenda. And frankly, I think we're seeing frustration on the left with some of the choices he's making with appointments. I think that's part of the thing that, like, when the most partisan members of our community say the Democrats as a whole are anathema to Jewish interests, that's going to create a different shift in the pushback, at least in the center.
I can't be the only one who, when I heard Sleepy Joe the first time, said that actually kind of sounds pretty nice, given what the last few years have been like. All right, I want to turn to the audience now and want to bring folks in with your questions. So please pop them into the chat. I'm going to start with Lauren Post, who, along with Marianne Weiss, was one of the other folks from IPF who had helped plan this. And so, Lauren, take yourself off mute and go ahead and jump in with your question.
Hi, I'm Lauren. This has been a really interesting discussion so far. So kind of going off of this back and forth that you guys have been having, Jeremy, you mentioned there's, partisan issues or people rather that have been elevated, and Batya kind of mentioned that as well. I am wondering what role you think that nonpartisan organizations, ostensibly nonpartisan, we all know what that means, can play going forward to kind of bring people together and kind of heal some of these rifts that we're seeing in the next 4 years, and even for the next generation and beyond.
I'll start first. Talk to people you disagree with and treat them with dignity. I just think that that's the key. Like, the Democrats do not treat working class people or religious people with dignity. They don't talk to them as though they have dignity. They don't talk to them like their religious views are dignified and important. And I honestly, I feel that so much of what ails us comes from the perceived or real contempt that the people on the other side of us educated liberal elites feel, and that's on us because we're the winners and they're the losers. And so I feel like the most important thing nonpartisan organizations can do is welcome in people who disagree with them, bring people together who disagree, and make sure that the people who actually are the winners are treating the people on the other side with respect and with dignity.
I'm going to agree with Batya on that. We're not going to.
I was going to say, disagree with me if you dare, Jeremy.
Okay. I will disagree with you on something you said earlier that connects to this topic. So I think that the obligation on Jewish leaders and Jewish institutions is to approach everything with an issue on an issue by issue basis, and I think that's an area, frankly, some of us have struggled with over the last 4 years. And I think where I disagree with Batya earlier is I do think that President Trump, in his efforts to make Israel a partisan issue, has succeeded to some extent to fracture a bipartisan center in the Jewish community on Israel-related issues. And, to use two examples, when the embassy was moved to Jerusalem, that has been the bipartisan consensus of the Jewish community going back to the Clinton administration about Jerusalem. The only question was whether it was should be the judgment of the American president about when to do that. And then some of us in the, some in the center tried to be like, we have always believed that Jerusalem is a capital, and like people, because Donald Trump was doing something, people flipped out. People who in any other circumstances would have been, yeah, Jerusalem's the capital, this is great. And similar with the UAE stuff this summer, I'll say from my organization, we put out a statement, broadly praising the UAE agreement. There's some complication around that now. But what was interesting was, I can't tell you how many people, moderately liberal Jews, were like, don't say anything don't say anything about UAE, don't say anything that says the president did a good thing. And in a prior time, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I think there would have been more unity across the center of the Jewish community around welcoming actions by a president of the United States that were broadly seen as good for Israel's regional standing. Whether you agree with them or disagree with them, I'm just saying, I think that's where the Jewish community is. So I do think we have to figure out how to recenter ourselves around, we take it issue by issue, and we compliment and praise people of both parties when they're with us on the issues, as institutions, as leaders. And I will say, to build on something that Batya said, we also have to be much more intentional about lifting up sort of like the sort of Hillel and Shammai approach to our communication as Jewish communities. So like, even if a part of the Jewish community is not at my particular table, how we talk about something and how we present it needs to lift up the minority, the dissent, the minority voice. And we have to, I think, be much more committed to the idea that the minority matters, not in terms of winning the argument, but in being represented in how the argument is framed. And that was very hard to do with Trump.
Yeah, I'll just speak very quickly for myself as somebody who is openly a Zionist and a progressive. I know the danger of saying anything positive about the Abraham Accords because of what the blowback would be if I just posted anything or said anything to anybody in my community, meaning outside of the Jewish community in particular. So I think you hit the nail on the head there. Jonah in Boston, you've got a question. And by the way, I enjoy reading your pieces too, Jonah.
Thank you very much, Oren. First of all, thank you, Batya and Jeremy, for joining us and speaking. Just to give a little bit of background, I identify myself as more of like a liberal or progressive Zionist. In the context of the Middle East, I support a two-state solution. This might be a little bit of a tangent, but it does have to do with polarization. Much of my family are Israeli Americans, so they're kind of in the American Jewish community, but their background is they're more of religious Zionists. They're more of like Yamina supporters, like Ayelet Shaked, if people here know who that is. They're like even farther to the right. So our polarization, if you will, is much more ideological, where they're like against the idea of like two states or reconciliation for out of principles. So my question is, how do you think our communities can reach out to each other and reconcile with each other? That being liberal Zionists like myself who support a two-state solution, and religious Zionists like them who like support people like Shaked, Bennett, and Smotrich.
I see Batya staring at me through this, and I'm like, okay, I'm going first here. As a general rule, I think liberal American Jews have done a sucky job of really hearing and understanding and validating that Israelis who have been voting for the various governments of the last 13 years have a valid perspective. And we all hinge ourselves, on a very small opposition, narrow part of the Israeli spectrum and basically dismiss out of hand. What are the broader, I'm going to distinguish because Jonah, I think you raised it in a very particular way of like the religious Zionist context. And I think I think there's like just a broader gap between the capital L liberal American Jew and even thinking like, oh, if you're voting for Netanyahu, you must be a racist. And like, this has been the attitude for the last 12 years in certain parts of liberal American Jewry. Or like, how can you be concerned about regional security in Iran and about the Gaza border and stuff when what's happening to the Palestinians is being done by our government, you know, the Israeli government. Like there's just a dismissiveness that isn't like actually engaging with and talking with actual Israelis in Israel. I understand in your case that's different. I also think, but to drill down in the religious Zionist sense, we don't respect the, I think liberal American Jews broadly, and I'm going to put myself in this camp, although I jump back and forth all over the place, aren't big fans of the idea of religion informing public values and public policy. And so a world perspective, even on Jewish peoplehood or Jewish statehood, or the significance of Israel in the Jewish national narrative that comes from a place of informed by religion, is really uncomfortable to a lot of liberal American Jews. And I think we have to interrogate our own biases about, and you know, you can map this on like, you know, and I have my own views about like, say, you know, the abortion debate in the United States is a good example of this, but I think we need to interrogate how we pass judgment and dismiss and shut down the ability to hear other parts of the spectrum of people who come to things from a deeply held religious perspective, informing public values or informing what they believe should be right for everyone, and not just for like religion as a personal practice and behavior, but also religion as a policy. And I'm sure I didn't answer that very well. I'm gonna have to clean that up later. Batya.
First of all, Oren, I'm horrified that you would identify with a movement that you feel like you can't, like, why would you be a progressive if you felt that being a progressive, the progressive community would reject you for embracing the miracle of the Abraham Accords? Like, to me, it seems like, I don't feel that it's important for Jews to be Democrats. I don't feel that it's important for Jews to be progressives. I do feel that it's very important for us not to identify with movements that we feel reject us or don't respect our views. So I'm sorry, but I find that horrifying. I know you just threw it in there, and I would love to hear you talk about it a little bit more. Should I answer first the question, or do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just very specifically clarify that what I said was, I know that there would be a price, meaning that there would be actors who would take shots at me for it. Not that I feel like I couldn't stand in the space and be accepted and welcome. Mm-hmm. I think that I identify as part of the movement in spite of those challenges, but there's a conscious, you know, a known truth that some things I'm going to say are going to bring attacks, even if I don't believe that the application of those attacks are the truest application of the values the movement claims to hold, which is what I would actually say back to those folks if we had a longer conversation.
Interesting. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so as to Jonah's question, okay, so something that, you know, there was this piece, there's an op-ed in the Times like a few weeks ago, and I think the headline was actually like, they said reach out to Trump supporters, I tried, it's not worth it. You know, it was like, that was literally the headline. And the whole argument was, you know, I tried to reach out to them and show them how stupid and wrong they are, and they did not listen and did not become Democrats. The whole thing was fallen. You know, it to me, it's like, what do you mean by reconciliation? Like, we're Jews, we're supposed to be in argument. We're supposed to be in the fight together. So to me, your job is to listen to them. And this is especially true if you want to persuade them to be two-staters. I would say this is doubly true if that's the goal, but if the goal is really just to be in community, like our opinions, the way that I see it is like, we are held hostage by our fears. Our opinions are simply like, our fears are holding us hostage, and they create opinions. And if you want to persuade somebody, you want to change their mind about someone, you are in a hostage negotiation with their fears. And everybody's fears are essentially about their children, their family. Will my children be safe? Will I be safe? Will my neighbors be safe? Will I be able to live in this world and hold my head up with pride, you know? And of course, if you're liberal, it's like, will the people in the furthest country away from here be safe? Because, you know, liberals for some reason find it really hard to like feel in-group feelings, positive feelings. But so basically, like, you have to convince them that you see what they see. Like you have to convince them that you understand where they're coming from and where what their fears are. Like they're not two-staters because they are afraid. And those fears are not irrational. They are rational fears because they have come from that place and they know what they're afraid of. So of course you and I know they're wrong, like we know we have the answers to that, but that's not how you go into this. Like your job going into that conversation is to listen and to love them and to find that way to truly feel their fear, so that when you are in a conversation with them, you can say to them, I see what you see. I mean, if this is interesting, I can tell you about this FBI hostage negotiation manual that I picked up once that has really interesting. All right, I'll just throw that out there. And if somebody wants to put that as a question in the chat, I will talk about hostage negotiation tactics and how to use it in your conversations.
I didn't expect that particular one. All right, who do I have queued up next? Rebecca Grossman.
Hi, thank you so much, Batya and Jeremy, for speaking to us today. It's been really wonderful hearing your discussion and responses to all of our questions. I actually have a question for each of you. Batya, at the beginning of this discussion, debate, whatever you want to call it, you had mentioned that you don't think that there's much polarization in the Jewish community, and if you drill down, we're very similar. Could you give an example of that exact situation where the community thinks, oh, this is such a polarized situation, we completely disagree on everything in this scenario, but when you drill down, we actually do agree? And then Jeremy, you were talking earlier as well about how people say, oh, everyone agrees with me, and then the other side, everyone agrees with me. And I was just wondering, how much of that do you see as a denominational divide, as Jews think that Jews think one way, but it's really only Jews in their denominational circles? Or do you think it's across all denominations, it's a mix of political applications of our Jewish values?
So I'll go first. I think the perfect example is like Trump and Israel. Like if you had said to me 4 years ago, what's going to happen with Trump and Israel, given where the Jewish community is at, or even like halfway through, right? Like we're so seemingly polarized on Trump, right? And like clearly that's going to involve like a huge break on Israel. But if you look at this guy is the most polarizing character in modern American history. And he did all of this stuff when it comes to Israel, right? But like, where do you think like Jewish public opinion is already on those questions? Like, most American Jews, they wanted to see the embassy move to Jerusalem. They didn't want Trump to do it because they don't like him. Okay, he did it. Do they want it moved back? No. Like, it's like, oh, you know what I mean? It's like, we're kind of, oh yeah, like, so we all ended up in the same place, like Abraham Accords, right? How could you not celebrate that, right? Even the Jews on the left, like it's so like as Jeremy was saying, like, they put out a statement. Yes, they had to word it carefully. They had to be super careful. But like, honestly, like where's the big divide? I would have assumed the whole time. I kept waiting for it to materialize, but it's like, we're all kind of still where we were, like, anti-occupation, pro-Israel, we're all Zionists. Like, it's like, where, like, to me, that if that was not going to divide us, like, I mean, that's like the perfect example, I think, for me. I could come up with others, but I feel like that one, it does a lot of work.
I really love Rebecca's question because it gives me a chance to talk about something. The short version of my answer is that I do not think it's strictly a denominational divide. Obviously, there are patterns that we can identify through polling, community surveys, that, for example, Orthodox Jews are more likely to lean towards a conservative worldview. I'm using that distinctly different from saying pro-Trump, that broadly speaking, the first and second generation Russian American Jews lean towards a more conservative worldview than other American Jews for a variety of reasons related to their experience, which is still, a sort of lived memory experience. So there are generalizations that can be made, and yet at the same time, I think that our inability to listen and create a spacious community conversation means we don't see how that plays out in other spaces. I can tell you point blank, in 2016, and in our own, like I'm a separate agency, but we're inside our Federation building. So we're talking about 200, mostly but not exclusively Jewish communal professionals working in a certain space, working for, you know, the big center liberal Jewish idea, you know. And in 2016, there were people in the building who were coming up to me very quietly say, I don't want my colleagues to know, but I'm thinking about voting for Donald Trump. And I can tell you for a fact that I have leaders in my own organization who self-identify as capital R Reform Jews, who also think of themselves as conservatives politically, Republicans, who feel homeless within their own temples. And I know Reform Jews here in Boston who have left their temples because they don't feel there's a home for them in those temples. Not a lot, but they're there. And if I know a few, I'm sure that is just the tip of a larger element of we haven't created the space for people to feel at home regardless of their politics. And I'm going to pull it back from Israel. I've seen it in my own council, our 120 people who sit at a table and debate things, where we have debated certain issues in recent years and try to adopt policy positions. And, you know, let's be honest, 90% of the room, there was a consensus on something, whatever. Like it was easy, like we were going to adopt it with a 90% consensus and nobody was speaking to the alternative point of view. And then somebody says, you know, what's the argument against this legislation that's being taken up in our state capitol? And somebody presenting it says, well, they're bigots. And like, that's actually played out in front of me on issues in our own space. And like, I'm like, hold on, that cannot be the answer. I will give you the argument against transgender public accommodations so that it's not just simply they're bigots. I'm going to give it to you because you need to hear that there is a legitimate argument against this bill on transgender public accommodations. It's not what I agree with, but I want you to hear it. And I think we need to do that to create the space for that person at the table to actually hold that point of view or espouse it, not because we have to all agree with it, but because in a community of 100 Jews, there are going to be 3 or 5 or 10, and we shouldn't be pushing them out over every individual issue. And we're not creating the space for that. And I'm going to say this to like, I think somebody raised this in the chat. It's not, so I think it was Leora. You know, the moral of the story is not about being the bigger person. It's also about being the smarter person. And like, what I would say is like, I'm not trying to be a bigger person than the person who's trying to shut me down or isn't interested in my perspective. But the more I understand genuinely, it goes to the same Batya was talking about like their fears and their anxieties and their concerns. The more I can understand and internalize and articulate those fears, actually makes me smarter at making my own case, and actually makes me better at finding the actual fault lines that can create a broader consensus.
I want to go to David Harari. I might screw up your name, so I apologize. David? And if you've maybe I'll try to read your question in case you hopped off. How much of the gap between Israeli American Jews do you think has to do with the Mizrahi Sephardi Ashkenazi divide, with the racism complex being flipped in Israel, where the left wing is largely associated with white socialists and racist towards Mizrahi historically? Complicated one, and I'm only going to give you 30 seconds each for an answer. Just kidding.
I'll just say a really quick, I'll tell you a quick story by way of answer, which is that I was in England like before COVID started. I think it was in January of last year. And I was at a dinner party and they were asking me about Trump, and I was talking about how Trump actually has a lot of like progressive economic policies. You know, he had this sort of very protectionist approach, workers oriented approach. He renegotiated NAFTA, he waged this trade war. You know, the auto industry really started to come back when they realized what he was doing, you know, helping farm workers. And this British guy interrupted me and started telling me why I was wrong. And I just looked at him and was like, you know, I'm not actually interested in what you think about American politics. Like, you live here. Like, if you're not interested in what I think, that's totally fine. But I actually don't care what some British person thinks about, you know, American politics. And I feel a little bit like that might be the problem, which is that, you know, we feel very entitled to have opinions about Israel. And in a way we are, because it's the Jewish state. And, you know, we are implicated in it, but we're not stakeholders. I'm not a citizen. Maybe you're a citizen, but, and I think that there's, you know, it's really important that there, you know, you have a certain humility when it comes to having opinions about certain areas, especially when it's not your children on the front line. So I think to me, that's the main issue there. But I agree with you that the racism question is flipped in a really interesting way, and we really do not talk about that enough.
I love the question, and I want to deepen the framework of that divide, because I think often it's very easy to look at it through the lens of like, well, the Mizrahim have, I don't know, certain perspectives that are informed by being still first or second generation memory of persecution in Arab lands and expulsion and sort of that experience of refugees. Or there are specific issues around racism and oppression and how integration happened in Israel that informed a certain politics there. Like, I think it's easy to look at it that way and say, therefore, there's this massive gap. But I actually think it's a much more complex and more deeply ingrained gap, which is that fundamental, and it's a little odd. And I say this, first of all, I say this as a Sephardic Jew, and I say this deeply connected to the reality of, as Batya knows, that the first generations of American Judaism were Sephardic Jewry. Still, and actually that is a Sephardic Jewry of Spain, not of the Middle East, North African world. American Judaism is fundamentally defined in the context of Christian civilization. And the Mizrahi Jewish experience, the Jewish experience over 1,500 years of the majority of Israeli Jews, is fundamentally created and informed in a non-Christian civilizational world. And those create huge gaps that go way beyond, oh, their experience was different from ours in the last 75 years or something, or their views of Arabs are informed by their experience of their parents in Baghdad or Cairo. It is at a much deeper level. So for American Jews, for example, our fundamental understanding of Judaism is organized around a reaction to Enlightened era Christian ideas of religion, which are completely alien to the Middle East, North African process of defining what Judaism is as identity. And so we're almost talking past each other when we even talk about what our Judaism means to us. And of course, that has only been hastened and deepened by the reality that 40% of the world's Jews are living in an actual Jewish state where Judaism is as easy as going outside and reading the street sign or listening to the weather on the morning radio in Ivrit, versus us as Americans who have a very different relationship. This week, Christmas week, national holiday, and what we've done to Hanukkah to normalize ourselves in a Christian culture. So like, I think the gap is much more profound and deeper than that.
Yeah, there's also take somebody who holds the framework of white supremacy as a core driving force in the West, drop them in the middle of Israel based on the experiences that they've had so far of experiencing Israel, and watch them be very confused about what they see in the dynamic in the country as they try to shapeshift their worldview to it. It's a pretty interesting thing. Okay, so you've got a few more minutes left. I want to do two specific things. I'm going to do rapid fire, a series of rapid fire questions. You don't get to expound. You have to stay in the framework of the question. And then after the rapid fire, we're going to do the poll, Dahlia. I want you to put up the poll, and then I'm curious, we'll get Batya's and Jeremy's input. All right, so rapid fire questions. All right, the conversation around Israel for our community is going to be easier, harder, or stay the same in the next 4 years?
Stay the same.
Harder.
The conversation around anti-Semitism, easier, harder, stay the same?
Harder.
Harder.
The pressure on Jewish professional institutions based on the overlapping of partisan and religious affiliation is going to create more, less, or similar levels of tension. So is the pressure going up, down, or staying the same on our professional institutions?
Pressure's going way down.
Stay the same.
Same question now for our religious institutions.
Pressure's going up.
Down. Why don't you just say glass half full, glass half empty, and one of us will answer it one way and the other way, and that'll just map on all of this.
All right, one last one. Democratic Jews and Republican Jews are going to move together, go further apart in the next 4 years.
I'm going to say about the same.
Okay.
Well, I don't think they're that far apart, so I guess the same.
Yeah. I guess I should reframe the question to say Republican Jewish organizations on Twitter and Democratic Jewish organizations on Twitter are going to send more nasty tweets or less or more conciliatory tweets. All right, Dahlia, let's do the poll. Let's see what everybody thinks.
Tell me you see it. You see it?
Yeah.
It's up.
Great.
It's up. All right, so this is out of a 5-point scale, right, Dahlia?
Yep. The closer to the right,
All
the
right.
more they agree. Closer to the left, more disagree.
All right, I want to sort of jump right to the Jewish communal institutions help alleviate polarization piece. And one of the things that we talked about in our pre-meeting with sort of the planners was, is there some type of incentive, and I sort of asked this before, is there some type of incentive problem that our institutions are responding to that might make them further divides as opposed to calm them?
I mean, if you're asking about like Matt Brooks and Haley Seufer, like the answer is yes. Their incentives are to act like.
I know what theirs. What about those who are ostensibly nonpartisan?
No, I honestly think that they were in a bind with Trump. Like, I feel for the position that a lot of these institutions were in, and hopefully it'll ease up. What do you think, Jeremy?
I would agree that I think most of the Jewish communal institutions really struggled to stay above any further partisan fracturing. And someday somebody can do an entire book about AIPAC over the last 5 years, for example, and how they tried to navigate this space. I think the challenge I'll throw in is that Jewish institutions, and I'll include my own, the reality is the chamber of stakeholders is a more narrow part of the Jewish community than the totality of the Jewish community. And I mean that both left and right. And the reality is, who are the people at the table invested in Jewish institutions, invested in the survival of the communal project? It is very much a subset of the total of the Jewish community.
Can we pull off the screen? I want to do like a very quick test question for everybody on rapid fire for whomever is like on video. I'm curious, especially for those sort of under 40, the young professional crowd that IPF Atid sort of caters to, how many of you believe that Jewish communal leadership is listening to our voices enough? Like, if you think they're listening enough, can I get a thumbs up reaction? I'm just gonna glance across the screen and see what the perception. We got some maybes, some sort of Jeans with a hard thumbs down, Rabbi Leo's with a hard thumbs down, David. All right, so to those of you who run Jewish institutions, take note. We're at best on the maybe so far. All right, so in just a couple minutes, Dahlia is gonna, from IPF, is gonna share a few more pieces of information, but we're a few minutes over time, so I wanna wrap up. First of all, Batya and Jeremy, thank you for your engagement and for being a part of this. We're not actually gonna be returning to the Zoom plenary, so we're gonna close everything out here. From my perspective, one of the reasons why I started engaging with IPF and continue to is this type of event. I've just always found everything the organization tries to do to be incredibly substantive and thoughtful. It is not about partisan tweets. It is really about in-depth understanding of the issues and creating a space for us to become knowledgeable and have meaningful conversations. At one point in time, I think I called IPF Atid's program the master's degree for the two-state solution, and I stand by that. I've learned a ton from the organization, and I would encourage everybody to keep engaging. And the staff is now, Dalia is going to talk a little bit about what to expect in 2021. And if you individually are willing, able, capable of helping to support IPF's year-end giving program, we'd be grateful if you would consider doing that so we can keep doing work like this. I think we'll put that into the chat as well. And with that, again, thank you, Jeremy and Batya, and I'll hand it off to Dalia.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Oren. Another thank you to Batya and Jeremy, and an especially big thank you to anyone who bared with me through the technical difficulties at the beginning. But I'm Dalia. I'm a member of Israel Policy Forum staff, probably the person who emailed you about this event. I highly encourage you to remain involved and engaged with our young professionals' work. Being involved can take many forms. Our staff and volunteer leadership teams have worked hard to develop opportunities for a range of interest levels and commitments. You can be involved locally with program planning and networking if you happen to live in a chapter city. You can stay informed and participate in our online conversations, especially in our open Facebook group. You can apply for leadership training opportunities as they arise throughout the calendar year. Israel Policy Forum hosts weekly virtual briefings on Tuesdays. Tomorrow they're hosting one called Between the Palestinians and the Gulf States. And there are so many other things you can do as well. Lastly, through surveys and focus groups in 2020, we've also continued to listen to the needs and wants of our growing IPF Atid community, which is now well beyond just a couple American cities and is truly an international network of change makers. Some cool announcements to expect from us in 2021 include enhanced partnerships with Israeli organizations, since we know our conversation is only enriched when we speak with voices in the region. New peer-to-peer networking opportunities for you all with fellow emerging leaders, since we recognize the heightened need to connect with each other in these isolating times, and more training opportunities for IPF Atid community members to sharpen their leadership skills, and plenty more to come. So that's all I have prepared. We'll plan to circulate many of these updates in the coming days and weeks, as well as recordings from the other sessions that you weren't able to attend tonight. From the Israel Policy Forum community and family, a happy and healthy new year, and may it be better than the last one. Thank you all so much.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure.